Well, after the lofty intellectual heights that Professor Mohanty reached, you come down to the somewhat more mundane reality of hearing a poet. But before I do that, let me express my happiness that the Raza Foundation has been able to support this creative theory colloquium, and we hope that we'll continue to do so, depending on how well you perform. You're already
good fun.
I seem to be the most inappropriate person to be speaking to you. I'm not a scholar, and I do not belong to the field of theory. I write poetry and sometimes about literature, culture, and visual arts and classical music, etc. But be that as it may, let me start by saying that if I take the various themes which the colloquium has, it would appear that, of course, contemporary could be apprehended, explored, understood through culture, politics, state, violence, movements, literature, gender, etc. Now, these are, of course, some of the themes which we are going to address during the colloquium. Now, it appears to me, while these general constructs are valid and necessary, there is a vast area of life as usual, of life lived in specifics and not in broad generalities. And I do not know how does theory address that. Theories tend to become autoerotic. They become obsessed with themselves, and one theoretical construction is engaging with another theoretical construction, etc., etc. While there is a vast reality, I mean, for instance, when all these things are happening, which Professor Mohanty so eloquently and so sharply delineated, people are living their life. They're falling in love, they're struggling, they're hoping, they're aspiring, they're weeping, they're singing, they're dancing, etc. Now, that part of the life is not such a small part. It's quite a large part. Now, I do not know whether theory has a way of addressing it or coming to terms with it. I hope it has, and if it has, I must plead ignorance, because my ignorance is appalling. Anyway, second point I like to make, that there are things which writers sometimes say which can be of some theoretical usage. I'll cite two examples. One is from Muktibodh, who used a concept of Jnanatmak Samvedan and Samvedanatmak Jnana. Sensibility as knowledge and knowledge as sensibility. Now, another colleague of mine, in fact, almost my age, was Malayaj, who talked about Khand Khand Sarjanatmakta, which means creativity in fragments, which cannot possibly be coalesced into a theoretical construct, but is there in fragments. And from them, the movements, etc., that Professor Mohanty mentioned, may be containing those fragments of creativity. The third is, sometimes change has different rhythms. I mean, it will, for instance, since the field I somewhat know or pretend to know, is that in literature, in theatre, in visual arts, the change takes place faster. In music, in dance, it takes place slowly. It takes place nonetheless, but the dynamics are different and the rhythms are different. Now, how there are absences and voids in our life. Maybe social absences, moral absences, social voids, moral voids. How do we cope with them? do we take them into consideration at all? I mean, I do not know. I'm only sort of making this question. There has been another area. One was the gentleman to whom this colloquium is dedicated seemed to have written a book on questioning the Eurocentrism. And there has been much talk over the years about how there are different ways of looking at reality, at life and existence, whatever. But I do not know if, for instance, we are so preoccupied with the Western concepts in aesthetics that we have almost completely ignored, or at least failed to discover, the relevance of Indian aesthetics. It's very strange that when you talk about literature, about visual arts, about theatre, you are using terms which are essentially Western. When you talk about music and dance, you are using terms which are basically Indian. There you are talking of rhythm and harmony and this, that and the other, and the rasa, blah, blah, blah. Now, it appears to me one of the tasks of the creative theory must be to bridge this gap thoughtfully, meticulously, rigorously. Not merely using one concept of dhwani and taking it off, because Derrida seemed to have mentioned it, or somebody like that. Foucault might have discovered it. What about our discovery? Why is it that we don't find, and this crisis is very deep in visual arts. In visual arts, the entire contemporary modern art criticism is couched in the Western aesthetics and the almost incomprehensible postmodernism. So you have a phenomena where there are, so Hussain and Raza and Tayyab Mehta and all of them may have made use of many traditional motives and all, but they are looked at through the Western eye. We have not even looked at them through an eye which more legitimately perhaps belonged to them. There has been some talk of reality. Now, as a writer, I can merely assert it that literature and the arts not merely reflect reality, not merely influence reality, they add to reality. And this is something which again is perhaps missed by theory. I don't know, if they don't miss it, so much the better, but if they do, they must reconsider how to negotiate that area. We are contributing, adding to reality, this additionality to reality. Maybe, I mean, ideas may not, ideas also are an addition to reality, not merely to understand reality or to explore reality or to question reality, etc. It has been mentioned here, and that I'll shut up. Religions have been taken very, very unseriously by us in the last 50 years, whereas they have now become the biggest threat to our democratic free existence. The argument was that it's a personal matter. What do you mean by personal matter? Religions are social institutions. I mean, the temple is sitting right there, the mosque is there, the church is there, their physical presence and their social activity cannot be ignored. And we are now seeing the emergence of a religiosity which is completely devoid of any spirituality, in fact completely devoid of any humanity, perhaps completely devoid of any God. This is a new religiosity being created and being practiced by the day. And we have no tools to understand how this has happened, why this has happened. We still tend to work in the binaries of the secular and religious, this, that, the other. I think that has run out its course. I mean, to be calling yourself a secular today is not necessarily being a very positive statement. I mean, the secular must, and I finish with an episode. You know, although I don't respond to Ramin Beguru, my friend's many emails, and he keeps on complaining about them. But there was a time when I used to write letters, and I started writing letters to the Prime Minister, no less, you know, I mean, none of these other lower functionaries, to the Prime Minister, to the President of India. I wrote a letter to the President of the United States when I was in ninth class, writing an anti-war letter. Truman was the fellow, and one day in my school, a huge parcel arrived in President Truman's office and sent me maps of the world. And I wrote a letter to Jawaharlal Nehru. And Jawaharlal Nehru replied, saying, don't get into all these problems now, it is your job to study at the moment. Which advice I never took seriously. And so I wrote a letter to Sonia Gandhi in 2004, when they were voted back to power. And I said, no, 2000, whatever. And I said, the spiritual in this country, I mean the secular in this country must spiritualize itself. And so the gulf between the spiritual and the secular must be bridged. Now how it gets bridged, I don't know. And I got a reply from her, this is a very interesting idea, but how do we do it? I don't even know now, how do I do it? There are some who should raise questions. There are others, more qualified people, who should provide the answers. Thank you.
Great.